to have Steve here as our final speaker. The reason you're here, Steve, obviously you've got a good story to tell us, and you tell that story well, and that's why it's always good to have somebody who can motivate us at the end of the conference. But as most of you, I'm sure, will have read, Steve is one of those entrepreneurial types, and we've already heard from Nigel today, who's established a business, got a background in local government, and from outside the sector identified an opportunity and is carrying it through in terms of Centro Otago, Pinot Noir, Carrick wines. So I'm just going to hand over, rather than try and preempt the story, I'm going to hand over to Steve to tell us about what his views are and what his story is. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. I also have a role as Chair of New Zealand Wine Growers, so I guess I do know a little bit more about the industry than just Pinot Noir. Well, no mean-spirited bastard ever made a decent Pinot Noir. And in New Zealand, we can make a decent Pinot Noir. In the space of 20 years, we have moved from a nobody in the production of Pinot Noir to a world leader. After France, New Zealand Pinot Noir has the highest value in export sales in most world markets, with the USA being one of the few exceptions. Our Pinot Noir is the New World equivalent to French Burgundy. Why Pinot Noir? First and foremost, it likes us. It likes our weather, our soils, our cool climate. It likes our cool winters and our dry autumns. It isn't an easy grape to grow. It has a thin skin, so it's susceptible to rot, botrytis, and other fungal diseases. It won't crop heavily, so it's expensive to grow. It then likes to rest in expensive French oak barrels for a year or more. But we like it too. It's considered to be the top grape variety in the world, so is sought after anywhere there is a fine wine culture. It attracts high prices. The wine media love it. Bloggers and wine geeks love it. Restaurateurs love it. And most importantly, we consumers love it. And it tastes good too. And what has this got to do with venison? Well, venison, like Pinot Noir, is often the star of the menu. It isn't the everyday dish for the kids when they get home from sport, but it is a dish that we serve when wanting to share a great meal or to impress our colleagues. It has panache and status. These icons, venison and Pinot Noir, have more value than just being stars. They provide a framework for other elements of our industries, and indeed for the economy as a whole. Take Pinot Noir. It is the second most planted variety in New Zealand. Sauvignon Blanc production outstrips Pinot Noir by a country mile. A month ago, I announced that our annual wine exports topped 1.5 billion for the first time. Wine is now New Zealand's 7th largest export category. 85% of those sales were Sauvignon Blanc. Last year we produced 220,000 tonnes of Sauvignon Blanc. We produced 25,000 tonnes of Pinot Noir. And of the Pinot Noir that we produced, 15% of it was produced for sparkling wine. The New Zealand wine industry is totally dependent on Sauvignon Blanc for its depth of market penetration. In fact, New Zealand would hardly be regarded as a wine-producing country if we didn't produce Sauvignon Blanc. We produce very good Sauvignon Blanc. Our style is distinctive and consumers love it. It's not so expensive that it can't be enjoyed by all wine drinkers. Sauvignon Blanc has been the forerunner for all New Zealand wine styles in all of our overseas markets. However, Sauvignon Blanc is considered to be a good wine, not a great wine. No feelings of nobility with this grape. Pinot Noir sales are tiny by comparison, but where they lack size, they help our industry through their halo effect. New Zealand Pinot Noir is produced in 3 key regions: Central Otago, Martinborough and Marlborough. They are important in different ways. Martinborough was the first region to produce consistently good Pinot Noir. In the late 1980s, the wines from this region, producers like Atarangi, Palliser, Dry River and Martinborough vineyards started to produce world-quality Pinot Noir, albeit in tiny volumes. This region provided the platform for New Zealand's current standing. Central Otago took the definition of New Zealand Pinot Noir a giant step forward. A dozen great producers working collaboratively made Central Otago Pinot Noir a must-have for any leading restaurant or wine outlet throughout the world. It attracted the top wine commentators: Jancis Robinson, Robert Parker's wine advocate, Steve Tanzer and Alan Meadows, names that probably don't resonate around this auditorium, but essentially the drivers of taste and therefore the drivers of sales and prices in the wine world. The wines are perfumed, packed with seductive fruit, elegant and long-lived. You could argue that without Central Otago, the profile of New Zealand's Pinot Noir would be much diminished. And Marlborough, as the largest producer of Pinot Noir, provides market depth. Good wines, not necessarily great wines, but in quantity and at prices that allow Pinot Noir to be drunk on a school night, not just at the weekend. 30 years ago, and you've been talking about 25 years back, but 30 years ago, you certainly wouldn't have asked me to present at this conference. You might have been aware that there was a wine industry in New Zealand, but you would not have seen it as significant or even relevant. You certainly would not have viewed it as an industry that could provide any value to your own. In the space of those 30 years, New Zealand wine has enjoyed exponential growth. From export sales of $4 million, we have risen to $1.5 billion. Our goal is $2 billion in export sales by 2020. We're about to hit $1.6 billion, and that's three months after we passed the 1.5 billion. So the catalyst for this growth was an initiative of the first Lange government, the Vine Pool. And this was a response to overproduction in the industry, resulting in uneconomic returns for producers. The government paid a subsidy for growers to remove vines with the objective of reducing the acreage of planted vines. Growers did remove vines, largely hybrid varieties and the ubiquitous Mulaturga. However, they did not leave the land unproductive. They replanted in French Vitis vinifera varieties, particularly Sauvignon Blanc, but also Chardonnay and Cabernet Sauvignon. Newly qualified New Zealand winemakers and a few Aussies then introduced modern, technologically advanced winemaking techniques to make fresh, flavoursome, exciting new wines based on these new varieties. They found new sites. Henderson and Te Kawata were superseded by Marlborough, Martinborough, Nelson, and more latterly, Waipara and Central Otago. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay were replanted with varieties that thrived in their regions. And a group of greenhorns took New Zealand wine to the world. New Zealand did not have a strong wine drinking culture. Beer was still the tipple of choice. However, the UK did, and it was to the UK that our winemakers went. These wines were well made and fresh. The labels were straightforward and easily deciphered compared to those of European producers, who are hidebound still in appellations, sub-regions, quality hierarchies, and producer-focused subtleties. Consumers loved the wines, and they understood them, and they bought them. The UK is no longer our largest market. About 10 years ago, it was surpassed by Australia. Traditionally, Australia was a country totally committed to its own producers. At that time, 95% of wine consumed in Australia was made in Australia. Now New Zealand has 70% of the Australian Sauvignon Blanc market, 40% of the Pinot Noir market, and 40% of the Pinot Gris market. In turn, Australia has been surpassed by the USA as our largest export market. Again, Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Noir are the flagships, but other varieties, Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, and Merlot, are all making inroads. And that has happened during a period when currency exchange values have been working against us, and other wine exporting countries enjoy huge financial support from their respective governments to compete against us in those markets. The future is possibly Asia, possibly China. There are some prerequisites: continued development of the Chinese middle class, ongoing education about wine in a traditionally non-wine drinking culture, wine ceasing to be a luxury product suitable for gift giving but not necessarily consumed. I've been to China a few times, and I'm amazed at how regularly my wine is purchased, not because the people that are tasting it like it, but because they believe that they can then present that, they've met the winemaker, it has authenticity, and they can then, in gifting the wine, have some established relationship with me. Many other Asian markets have a sophisticated wine drinking culture, Japan, Hong Kong, and Singapore particularly. However, the competition is high, and there is a fascination with the wines of Europe to overcome. China does achieve the highest average price for our exports, being double the average export price for all exports. In China, our average export price is $14.82 a litre versus $7.25 for all other exports. There's a real interest in both red wines and the more delicate aromatics, Pinot Gris, Riesling, and Sauvignon Blanc. Europe, the market so important to you as venison producers, is not so important to us. Germany, France, Italy, and Spain have hugely developed wine industries, with much of their product being consumed locally. Large production subsidies mean that we cannot compete on price. And European wine snobs are the best wine snobs in the world. So the top end of the market is pretty inaccessible. We are more successful in the north. Sweden, Denmark, Norway have real potential, but centralised government buying agencies make these markets difficult to enter and to thrive in. A small trickle of wines filter through, but change will not be dramatic. Like your industry, globalisation has both benefits and drawbacks. Markets do become more accessible as trade barriers are removed and opportunities develop. However, easier market accessibility puts our competitors on an equal footing. And our competitors thrive in a domestic environment far different from our own. Our excise regime, our tax, while fairly applied, is one of our largest costs. There are no subsidies for production, and even our exports have to pay for expenses incurred by the government facilitating and monitoring our quality regimes. It was ironic that this time last year, the government introduced further costs on the industry for export sales by way of a levy, and at the same time, exactly the same time, the EU announced massive marketing subsidies to its members to expand their export markets outside Europe, those markets in which we compete. So what is our competitive advantage? Good wines, well made, efficiently made, but from a relatively high value wage economy. Our Kiwi can-do attitude in growing, producing and marketing wine. Our biggest advantage can be put into 3 words that must appear on every bottle. Those words, New Zealand wine. Or it can be wine of New Zealand. Is that 4? Our place and our reputation are our best assets. Our reputation for making wine sustainably, for New Zealand's clean and green image, for our workforce practices, for our food quality. These advantages we must protect. In some respects, they are more at risk now than they have ever been. Food contamination of New Zealand produce, real or perceived, water quality complaints, fly-by-night labour contractors can systematically and irrevocably erode our position and that crucial advantage that we have in the market. I started by talking about Pinot Noir and its relationship with venison. They are better than great companions. They are a match made in heaven. I have a Central Otago winery, Carrick. My wife and I are also keen trampers. So it was a real compliment to us when our wine was included in a book recently published entitled Gourmet Tramping in New Zealand. The chosen wine was our Carrick Pinot Noir, and the matching dish was venison medallions. The location was a Siberia hut on the Young Wilkin track in the Aspiring National Park. Being keen trampers, Barbara and I had to try this out. Pinot Noir and venison, high in New Zealand's backcountry, a star-filled night with a roaring fire. Thank you. Now, I'm pretty happy. I know we've got a little bit of time, haven't we, Andy?
Time.
So I'm happy to take questions from not just what I've spoken about, but anything about the wine industry. And some of the things that you were saying before resonated with me. So I might use those as part of that response. But anyway, are there questions? Yes.
Steve, thanks, and enjoy that. The New Zealand meat industry has quite a bit of Chinese investment these days.
Yes.
Just wondering, is there much Chinese investment in the wine industry, and do you see that as being an area of growth?
Yes and no. There is some interest from the Chinese. New Zealand wine, the larger producers, and a lot of them are overseas owned. So you've got Pernod Ricard, of course, is French-based. Constellation, Kim Crawford brands, they're USA-based. Treasury in Australia own a big chunk of Matua Valley and Accolade, etc. So we've got quite a lot of overseas investment already in the industry. We're seeing investment and interest from China and from Japan, in particular, more investment from the USA. We don't see it as a bad thing. In fact, we see it as capital inflow, and often with that becomes we're seeing more money available for development of our industry. So we've been quite supportive of that capital inflow. Yeah.
Okay. I'll just sneak one other question in. Just interested to know what the wine industry is doing in terms of establishing a proof of origin.
We have at the moment wine export certification. Currently, if you want to sell wine overseas, your wine goes through a testing regime. So it goes through both a laboratory testing regime, and then it also goes through a panel tasting of other winemakers. And they have to certify that wine is A, fit for purpose, B, that it's non-melodious, and there's some criteria. So having ticked off those two elements, then you can get wine export certification. 85% of New Zealand wine is exported in the bottle, and on that bottle you have to have origin labelling. So it has to have wine of New Zealand. It can also have wine of region, and there's a bill, I'm flying to Wellington tomorrow actually, to present to the Select Committee, because we have a bill before Parliament establishing geographic indicators for wine, where that takes it a step further. But irrespective of that, you've still got the Consumer Guarantees Act with that applying. So we have very clear rules for wine that's exported in its final form. We are now seeing a growing development of exports of wine in bulk. Now that's happening in two ways. Some of the bigger companies can package that wine less expensively overseas, and so that's how that's being bottled, and we have no problems with that. The wine still goes through the export certification process, and we ask for the wine to be now, once it's bottled overseas, for that to be brought back to New Zealand so we can check it. But at the moment, MPI have not agreed that they will monitor that, so that's basically self-monitoring. Our problem is going to be, and we talked about authenticity before, if we get wine that's being exported in bulk to, say, China or even the USA, where there's different criteria applying, we run the risk of contamination, we run the risk of a change from the product, still trying to use that New Zealand labelling identity. So it's one of the biggest problems we've got with the government, and we've been talking to them over the last 2 or 3 years on this. We get so far and then there's pushback. So just, I think you probably experienced similar. Yeah.
Steve, thanks for the talk. I think you've just given us one example, but the venison industry, and you heard the conversation about velvet. We're thinking about and working hard on collaboration. Can you give us some examples? I know there's some examples from the wine industry of collaboration amongst marketers.
Amongst marketers, there's a lot of collaboration, and I'll use my own personal experience, I think, with Central Otago. I said in my speech about a dozen of us getting together and promoting Central Otago Pinot Noir as a region. This is quite recent, so we go back just 10 years almost, maybe 12 years. And we decided to set up a company called Central Otago Pinot Noir Limited, and it was owned by the Regional Association, which is simply an incorporated society. But that company, of which I was the chair, we decided that we would market together. So we were still marketing under our own brand. So you still had the Mount Difficulty and the Carrick and the Felton Road and the Courts Reef. But what we were doing was marketing together, so we made impact in the market. The first thing we did was we went to London. No region in the world outside of France had ever been to the UK as a region and promoted itself. We had an amazing success. From that, we've been able to bring a lot of those sort of key stakeholders, if you like, or people who have key influences, I guess, in the industry to New Zealand, to Central Otago. We've run fairs, we've run events. They're always, super exciting out there, and they've been so successful. This year, we've been invited, and this probably won't mean much to you unless you're, sort of a wine geek. But Central Otago has been invited to go to Burgundy. Burgundy's never invited anyone to go to Burgundy. They've invited us to go to Burgundy. This is the Burgundian producers, to present our wines, and we're going to do a dinner at a company called Domaine Romano Conti. Anyone who's heard of that will know that you can't buy a DRC wine for under $1,000 a bottle, and it's all on allocation. They have asked us to be there. There's 12 of us going next year, or later this year. That's the sort of recognition that we've got. And it's really from just developing that joint brand. If we tried to do it individually, we would have been totally unsuccessful. We'd be still squabbling in the New Zealand market or maybe an Aussie.
You've got a connoisseur. You've got a connoisseur in the front row. There, so just getting excited. Chris next, and then Graham, and then Sharon.
Steve, I just wondered what production fluctuations do you have other than season, more due to price, and do your growers take a long-term view, or do you see a reasonable turnover of people that get in and get out? Because I know it's a long-term proposition when you plant the grapes, but I just wondered, is that a big issue like it is for us?
Yes, it is. And I smiled before. Sorry, I'm going to go totally off tack, so remind me to come back to your point. You were talking about the 5% growth, limiting it to 5% growth. 2008, I don't know if you recall, we had the perfect storm. We had a huge vintage and a GFC. And we said to our growers, grow only what we can manage to sell. And we weren't very specific. We were sort of almost as specific as you guys were talking today. I spent 6 hours in front of the Commerce Commission because we said that. And when they said, well, you've got legal advice here from the industry, but we're going to have a look at you personally. Have you got your own personal legal advisor? I realised it was starting to get serious. So we're a bit careful about what we say to the industry now in terms of managing growth or managing yield, really. I guess wine is a little bit different because once the grapes are planted, it's really the weather which largely determines how yield will fluctuate from year to year. We're going to have a big vintage this year. It's going to be as big as 2014 and as big as 2008. If we hadn't had a small vintage in 2015, we would be very, very worried. Luckily, the vats are empty and we're actually struggling for product. But these fluctuations have two effects. Firstly, when you have a low year and the growers are looking at their bank statements and they're seeing they're not looking particularly flush, the next year the inclination is to overproduce to compensate. So we do have this problem of trying to manage the sales of that wine in a short cycle. It doesn't matter so much with some wines, but unfortunately Sauvignon Blanc is a wine that's people believe it should be drunk in the year of its production. So Sauvignon Blanc, because it's our biggest driver, that's our biggest problem. So yeah, we do have that. It does create tensions within the industry because wineries who are selling the wine would much prefer the growers to reduce their yields in those high yielding years, but you can understand why they are looking to maximise their values.
Yeah, I guess where I was coming at was pastoral farming. There's a tendency to look over the fence to see what's making best dollar on the day, and it's reasonably easy to go from one to the other by just putting them on a truck and sending them away. Yeah. It's a bit more difficult with vineyard, but do you still see that happening where people just toss their hands in the air and exit?
Not to the same extent. There's quite a different dynamic in the wine industry from the dairy industry, and Andrew and I were just talking about this over a coffee before. The wine industry is very, very easy to enter. So you have this sort of peripheral action going on around the core industry. And these are companies that will buy grapes or buy finished wine in bulk in big years certainly they'll get it at a lower price, but then they've generally, based on their markets, that they can actually move that product.
Tell us the Graham Norton.
Yeah,
example.
well, I thought that was a good example. I mean, Graham Norton, the comedian, he's through his associate company, he's actually a New Zealand wine producer. Now, he's probably, I suppose he's been to New Zealand. He certainly doesn't own any grapes, he doesn't own any wine, he doesn't own any vats or tanks or presses or anything. So no infrastructure. But what he's doing with a couple of colleagues is buying juice, finished juice, packaging it, putting their name on it, and because they're doing that in New Zealand, they're a member of our organisation. So they have quite different ideals and concerns and issues than I do as a grower who grows their own grapes, makes their own wine, sells it myself. So that, there's quite a different dynamic. So that easy entry, on one hand, those of us who've been in the industry a while sort of look over our shoulders and say, why the hell are we supporting this bastard? But on the other hand, he's actually taking off, or not so much him, but some of these other companies like Woolworths Australia is taking off a chunk of that overproduction that may have produced problems for us otherwise. So it's an interesting dynamic, and it's a bit of a two-edged sword.
We're just coming under time pressure, but I'm going to get 2 quick questions and 2 quick answers in. Sharon and then Graham.
Seeing these products go so well together, is there any cooperating marketing at the moment or possibilities in future? Like when we have these big food fairs, can you have venison and Pinot Noir together? Or when we develop marketing material for venison, can we have a matching, Pinot Noir on it and vice versa? Is there scope for us to benefit each other, really?
I think there probably is. The logistics I'm not so sure about. I know that we certainly, in our restaurant, we've got a restaurant attached to the winery, and we were part of the Silver Ferns top 12 last year, and we matched our Pinot with venison. So on a sort of one-off basis, it's relatively straightforward, but on an industry basis, it's probably more difficult, but it's not impossible, and I think it's something that our marketing guys would certainly be interested in talking through. Yeah.
Thanks. Graham?
Tim, I wondered if you might comment about what your growth strategies are, where you see the industry going into the future, in terms of hectares, I really mean, and what are some of the dynamics that will grow that, namely perhaps some of the proposed irrigation schemes around the country?
Yeah, well, we're probably not so supportive of irrigation schemes. Grapes don't require a lot of water. They do require water at the right time of the year, but they don't actually require a lot of water. We would rather see, and our growth strategy as an industry is based on growing value, not so much volume. We believe that there's excellent opportunity for us to double the sales of in our total sales of export wine with a minimal increase in production area. How can I answer this question without being too long-winded? But let's go back to 2008. 2008, I said, was the perfect storm with the really high production. That was fueled largely by banks and by people entering the industry without any knowledge of the long-term sales and marketing needs. So the banks essentially had a template. You tick the boxes, and like the dairy industry now, or probably not now, a few years ago, at that time, wine industry, we were the darling. Yeah, the banks would tick it off, and no problem with financing it. Current planting now is by big companies, and it's largely to ensure that they've got supply, because they don't want to be competing to the same extent as they have been in the past for product from simply growers. So we've got growers in the market who don't make wine, they just grow for big companies, and the bigger companies are just wanting ready to secure supply. So that's what's happening. Marlborough is also being planted out. There's not much of Marlborough left. We estimate that probably about 10 years, most of the land in Marlborough will be planted in grapes that can be planted in grapes. So then we've got to look for other regions, and other regions are not so straightforward. There's small pockets of planting available in central Otago, maybe in central Hawke's Bay, but it's not so straightforward. So our growth strategy as an industry is really based on growing value, and the way we're trying to do that is obviously enter markets like China, but also to build our pricing strategies in those other export markets, particularly the UK. The UK is actually a very low price yield for us.
Sounds like a good way to finish, Steve, aiming to grow value.
Yeah.
And so that's a good message. I could see my wife and Annie Mitchell up there when you started talking about Pinot Noir and venison in the Siberia hut, gourmet tramping. It's really got a resonance about it. Just got to work out how to carry wine too far up a hill.
Oh, it's not hard.
It's worth it for the end result. Look, really appreciate the fact you've come and shared with us some views. So there's a little appreciation of the effort you've made, and.